healthcare providers, to third parties that can be done from any doctor or nurse practitioner's office anywhere in the world. So any health professional in the US who believes that a genetic test should be done can get it done. So by no means does it matter where you get your care. The second is that there now is a research study, as Mike corrected me, not all of me, but all of us, which the US is doing, where 1 million people are going to volunteer to have their genome sequenced and have all kinds of health data collected of them to try to further our understanding. And this is actually a bigger study than a study in the United Kingdom, which has been going on for a number of years. So you all could just sign up and say, I want to have my genome sequenced as part of a 1 million-person study in this country at no cost to you, but information is going to be gotten on every one of those people. The last is 23andMe. I was thinking about this last night after the third star was in the sky and my television was on, that there was an ad during the football game for 23andMe. And 23andMe will talk a little bit about, and people can ask questions, and I don't bring it up to that. And I've spoken to people there, including the founders. It's a really exciting concept, but it's basically direct-to-consumer genetic testing. But the reason I bring it up was I was thinking about it this morning. You know, if you've seen this ad where they show people that drink a lot of caffeine and they show that they have a genetic alteration or they sleep late or they're a night person, this idea that you can get a genetic test and it kind of explains things to some degree about yourself, an individual, and we'll come back to that. My point is, you don't even need a doctor. You can just send your swab or your tube of blood away and get the answer, and then Lauren will talk about genealogy, that some people say it's not for health. I just want to access my genetic information to understand myself and my family, my community. So we enter a new world. Go ahead.
Is there any protection as to who has access to this information?
The short answer is that there is and there isn't. There are laws in this country, like HIPAA and other laws, that do protect the ability of information to be shared with others. However, there are two things about that. The first is that those laws are always 3 years behind where the science is. The reality is that when we sequence a genome, we actually can figure out from that sequence who that individual is. So even if you deleted who the name of that person and everything else, we actually can figure it out, and there are people who can figure that out. And yes, the law protects you from doing that, but there's lots of people out there, as we've learned with elections in the last few years, that can take information and figure that out. So I think the short answer is there are protections, but they're not complete. The second thing I'll bring up is that we currently have laws that allow you to get health insurance without pre-existing conditions, but that's been a moving target. And I'll just remind you that having a genetic event that places you at high risk for a disease is as much a risk factor for disease as having a disease. And so right now there's legal protections to protect you against that information being used to decide if you're insurable. That could change. And when we think about these big dialogues happening, something I worry a lot about as a doctor is ensuring that we always are really rigorous at utterly protecting that privacy, with the caveats that it's never gonna, we're never gonna anticipate every scenario.
I actually have two questions. One is related to that. If I get tested and I have a pre-existing condition, well, I'm on Medicare, so nothing's gonna change. But my children are not, and so how much of that is available, and they can figure out that, well, if I have a certain predisposition, perhaps they do. And the other question that I have is the work that was done in the book that was written by Rebecca Skloot about the Henrietta Lacks, the cancer study. It had a lot to do not only with privacy, but with who profits from the information that you're given, and how is that related to these genealogy-focused platforms?
We should come back to the who profits maybe at the end in the dialogue. It's a really interesting and complicated area, and it's one where I think the law is more on the benefit of the institution than the individual currently, and will be interesting to see as those legal challenges move forward how that is. In fact, there's been no evidence I'm aware of in the Henrietta Lacks case so far that legally that they weren't allowed to develop that cell line. It's more about morally and ethically what they should have done and how they should have acknowledged it. The reality is that this is an important area where I think, again, the law and ethics may have some commonality, but it's complicated. The other question you brought up was about
If I get tested and
the The issue of children, this is a big issue, and I will, again will address that after the genealogy discussion in the cancer context, where if you get tested for cancer risk and you have something that is not in your tumor, but rather something you inherited, that has a butterfly effect. It affects lots of other individuals. We have to think very carefully about that. We have policies and regulations, but they're complicated, and especially for children under 18, who they're not able to make a fully informed decision. And imagine you get a test that impacts them. This comes up with Huntington's disease, you probably know all the time. That people know that they have Huntington's disease, but do you test a teenager who could have a fatal disease, or do they have to become an adult to decide? Massive implications that I think we do as best we can, but with lots of mistakes along the way. So by no means am I going to make the argument that as society or as doctors, we've got it down pat. The answer is, we do. I think people try to do the best they can, but plenty of yips along the way.
To speak to that directly, my mom did a SK and PET, and
Yeah.
her tumor had Lynch syndrome. So before I got the blood back, I was Googling, and I almost had a heart attack
Yep.
because of Lynch syndrome. So it's not in her blood, right? So if I did 23andMe and I didn't talk to a doctor or a genetic counselor and I just saw Lynch syndrome, I would be very nervous. So with Lynch syndrome, they say, remove your colon proactively, remove your breasts, remove your ovaries, that's a lot of information to get without having a genetic test.
I'll tell one story, and then I really want to get to move on. That the 23andMe story that taught me something. This gets back to something that I think Harry said earlier about them telling stories and being in a business. And again, there's some high-quality scientific people there. I'm not by any means besmirching that at 23andMe there's some of the best people thinking about these issues. I was called for them because they had an interest because of a board member who had blood cancer, and they wanted to look in their entire database of people about who might be at risk for a blood cancer. And I said that as long as that's in your consent, it's fine. But they said, actually, we put on the chip for 23andMe, in addition to risk factors, we actually put a genetic variant that's not a risk, but that they have it. It turns out it's a mutation that I described when I was a trainee in the mid-2000s. And they said, actually, we can find 1,000 people that have this that don't know that they have it. And I said, did you tell people when they sent their blood to you that you would be testing them for having an actual disease at that moment, or at least having a genetic event? That means that somebody should at least think about it, and it could weigh on them, and think about their life, because maybe they don't have it yet, but this is not like risk. This is they have a mutation in their blood that they would go talk to me. And they said, well, we've talked to our lawyers, and the way we wrote our consent, which was totally fuzzy, we're totally within legal rights. And I was ethically bothered and took my name off the research paper because I didn't feel comfortable, not that they didn't do the legal obligation, but with the ethical and moral obligation, that they should have spelled out in more detail what they were testing and what it meant. Because it's not just about doing what a lawyer, it's about leaving the room. And it's just one example I had where, they wrote the study. It was actually a really nice study. The methodologies were good, but I thought that I just wasn't comfortable with the idea that they went beyond maybe what a lawyer said they could do. But it didn't pass for me the sniff test, and I guess to me that mattered. I don't know if that makes sense to everybody. And I think you kind of implied that earlier in your talk, that some of these companies, what they want to get out of it's very different than what we as academicians and as patients want to get out of it. We just have to get comfortable with that. It doesn't make them wrong. It just means there are different incentives.
The other thing is, and I don't want to speak, there are some of those home testing that'll say you're BRCA negative, right? But they're not testing the whole BRCA gene. They're testing the 4 most common mutations associated with BRCA. So somebody could leave there thinking, oh, I'm okay, when they're not okay. I mean, I had a patient whose mom was BRCA, and she came to me, and her previous doctor was going to do the saliva, one of these types of tests, and I said, no, we really need to do the full BRCA gene and get you tested, and she was positive. And then I called that company, and I said, I have to ask you a question. If my patient had done your test, is this one of the genes that you would have gotten, would have found? And they said, no, that's not in our panel. So it's a little scary to me because it can give false comfort.
Yeah. Was there a question in the back?
Yeah, I think the term you were looking for is informed consent. They were not giving full informed consent.
You know, the lawyers said they were giving informed consent. My issue was that informed consent and a person being informed at a level that we're all comfortable with are not exactly totally the same thing. And there have been some changes, I think, in the informed consent that are brewing and evolving. So our hope is that we're moving in a direction where we're getting to a better place. But, you know, and again, I want to give this to Lauren a sec. I remind you all, again, another example you probably all read about is these examples now where they're using genealogy to find folks who commit crimes. And I'm not by any means saying that you shouldn't do that. I get that. But the question would be like when you do a genealogy test, you know, your information is going into a database that then potentially, and my view of these things is that should be like written out there, like in like black and white. Like police are gonna see it, and they may, I don't, just like we all want to live, like I think that we should lay out as best we can in any moment, all of the real potential scenarios with the caveat that you never totally do.
I don't want to contradict you at all, Russ, but in that particular case, and I'm certainly not the direct-to-consumer companies, they didn't put the data into the GetMatch database.
That's right.
The users, so there's willing complicity on the part of many users who are sharing their genetic information. Maybe you guys are going to talk about it more, but I think it's another manifestation of the Facebook phenomenon of people giving their privacy.
I think you're dead on right.
I was actually going to add that there's the issue with those forensic cases, and I don't want to go too deep into that because we have other things here, but those cases, I think there was one in the Sacramento area, as I recall, those are people who may have tested through these private companies, Ancestry, 23andMe, MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA, all of these different places, but then they have downloaded it's called raw data, downloaded that and uploaded it to GEDmatch. GEDmatch is a free database that is they're not governed by any of these issues. So those matches that the law enforcement officials were able to find were on GEDmatch. They were not, for example, I'll show you a bunch of ancestry matches today. That's not where the law enforcement officials were looking. They were looking on GEDmatch. And so it's, I don't want to say it's a way to get around the issues, but it definitely, this is information put out there willingly, yes. And to be clear, the criminals themselves, the fugitives, were not putting their DNA out there, on these databases. You didn't have I think it was the Sacramento State Killer or something. I don't remember what it was called. Golden State Killer. Thank you. That person didn't spit into a tube and send it to Ancestry. That's not what was happening. It's that there was DNA collected at the time from the crime scenes that was saved by law enforcement. That DNA was tested more recently, uploaded to GEDmatch, and matches were discovered that you'll see really similarly to what I'm going to show you that I did for a client. They were able to triangulate those matches in order to figure out who the question mark DNA was from, and made the arrest. And because DNA doesn't lie in the sense that when they found DNA, they tested this guy's garbage. It's an exact match. It's not.
And before we get into the genealogy and Lauren tells her, I just want to tell one experience I had as a trainee that I think gets, again, just these issues broadly that I vividly remember. I was a fellow in our hematology clinic at Mass General Hospital. I saw a woman who came because she was worried that she had a and she was a genetic heritage where they were at higher risk, not Jewish, but another heritage. And she, in fact, tested in positive for having homozygous risk, so had risk, didn't have it, and it was appropriate for her to come. And the question was whether or not her family should come. And we said, if you have siblings, it would make sense for them to be tested. So she brought her sister to our clinic, and the sister tested with a different genotype that was only explainable by having different paternity than the sister. And they're sitting in the room with me as a trainee. I've been a doctor for about 3 years. And I have the reports. And it was obvious to me within 10 seconds that the answer was they had different fathers. Because they had a homozygous, the other was a complex heterozygote, so they shared the mother's genotype but not the father. But I sat with my attending who was a world leader, and what do you do in that scenario? And I decided to just play it straight, said this is the information, and didn't interpret it to say your paternity, and said if they asked the question, I would answer with veracity, and if they didn't and they came back for the next visit, I would answer it. And it took them actually till a follow-up visit to ask, and we just said the data says X. But my point was, by never in a million years did these two women think that in their life that they didn't have the same father, that their mother ever thought they would figure it out, and that being tested for a disease of iron would lead to that observation. And the mother, who I ultimately met, and it ended up, no, at least as far as I knew, for the year and a half I took care of them, no other fact that we were able to, because they actually had different care implications, so one had to get treated, the other did not. So there were real implications. This wasn't, you couldn't finesse this. But my point, the lesson I learned here was that once you do genetics, it's not going to lie. And at the end of the day, you're sometimes going to learn stuff. I would have never thought to say to the person I tested, well, only bring your sister if she's comfortable with the 1 in a million chance that when we test you two, that I'm going to learn that you don't have the same father. Right? I mean, I'm looking at Sherry because, you have a 15-minute interaction with somebody, and there's a lot to talk about. But that's just the reality.
Yeah.
Because I know so many people that are BRCA positive, the before study, Drs. Johncheck and Robson.
Yeah.
So if you're Ashkenazi, you get free BRCA.
And I'll get back to BRCA. Absolutely.
Okay. So moving on to genetic genealogy. Genetic genealogy research is comparing our DNA test results with those of millions of people in several databases to find relatives we previously could not find. So this can be helpful in locating living relatives with whom we've lost contact, descendants of branches that have, fallen out of contact, or identify lost branches from the past. You find matches for people that may have different surnames. Maybe there were two brothers who took different surnames in the past, which really, for Ashkenazic Jews, was not that far in the past that we adopted surnames. And something that was raised this morning, one of the peculiarities in Ashkenazic Jewish research is the issue of endogamy. So, the bottleneck of population was discussed earlier, that the fact that endogamy, I don't know if everyone was here earlier, defined as the custom of marrying only within a particular community for many generations. And what that does to the DNA results, the matches, it can create a lot of false positives. So, for example, in my own family, I'll show you an example. These are my test results, and you see my closest matches are labeled. This is a screenshot from Ancestry. Most of what I'll show you, it's just easy to show this way. All the databases have very similar ways of showing this. All, of course, have their own peculiar differences. But, even here you see it says a second cousin match, possible range, second to third cousin. That's an estimate based on various algorithms and the software they're using. So it's important to keep in mind that second cousin doesn't mean second cousin. It could mean first cousin twice removed. It could mean second cousin once removed. It could mean a lot of different things. But these are my second cousin matches. All three are known to me. I know how they connect to me. Sandra Kinkella is a relative, a cousin on my maternal grandfather's side. And the second two, Leslie Feldman and Bob Corwin, are relatives on my paternal grandfather's side. So this wasn't that surprising to me, but as, again, all the databases will allow you to do this, you can look at the shared matches you have with each person, which you'll see can be very, very useful. You'll see in the case study we'll look at in a minute. So I looked at the shared matches with Leslie Feldman and saw Bob Corwin. Not surprisingly, I know he's related on the same side, the same Cohen branch from Belarus, and then Samantha Corwin, who obviously related to Bob, and so that all makes sense. And then down here I saw Kira Rosenfeld. Kira Rosenfeld is my cousin, my third cousin, I know who she is, on my maternal grandfather's side. Now, that doesn't make any sense because, yeah, I've had my parents tested. They're not related, at least not closely enough to come up in these tests. But Bob Corwin, Samantha Corwin, and Leslie Feldman come up as a match to someone on the other side of my family. So you have three people on my father's side related to someone on my mother's side. And the most likely explanation for that is the endogamy. So when people are looking at the various levels of matches and the kinds of matches, and people are comparing surnames and towns, I get messages all the time from people saying, I'm a fourth cousin match to you, and here's my list of surnames and towns. Do you recognize anything? Generally, the answer is no. And I have to reply delicately, but generally the answer is, especially with, let's say, third cousin matches. I've been researching my family for a long time. I can document all of my third cousins. It's generally that it's endogamy at play. So maybe we're sixth cousins twice, maybe we're ninth cousins 3 times, or some, very, some other combination of that. So it just shows how messed up things can get. And again, the false positives. So then, there's Kira Rosenfeld. Moving on to case study. This is a client that I had over the last year and a half or so. And it's important with any genealogy research to start with what you know. So the client came to me and said, look, my great-grandfather, Jack Stanley Williams, I don't know, his daughters, my grandmother and her sister are still alive, and they just want to know who he was. He was present throughout their lives. He died in the late 1960s, I think, at about 70-something years old. We don't know anything about him. We don't know where he came from. He said he was born in New York. Documents we have, marriage certificates, things like that for him, indicate he was born sometime between 1893 and 1897 because he used many different dates and years in that range. And we don't know anything. We don't know his parents. We don't know siblings. All we know is that he said on documents that his parents were John Williams and Mary or Vera Stanley. He was orphaned. I put orphan in quotes because it's important to remember that orphaned in his context might mean something different than what it means to us. We think of it as referring to a child who's lost both parents. Orphaned in the early part of the 20th century often meant losing one parent, very often losing a father, because it would have put you in a very precarious economic position. So that's, you'll see it's important later. He was orphaned sometime before he enlisted in the U.S. military. He enlisted, we believe, sometime around 1915 or 16 and served through World War I. We have the information about the companies he served with from him, things that he wrote that information on. We have a photo of him from World War I. Eventually, he lived in Seattle for a period of time and then married twice in Rhode Island and stayed in Rhode Island for the rest of his life. But they don't know anything about him before he enlisted. So first thing to start with, for me, is always paper research. Okay, let's find his military records. Unfortunately, they all burned in a fire in St. Louis. It was a famous fire in military archives in St. Louis in the early 1970s. And some piles did survive, his did not. So I asked them I asked the client if the two daughters of Jack Williams would be willing to be tested, to test their DNA, because I really felt that was the only shot. And they said yes. We sent everything in. I also asked, several other questions, including, do you know anything about his background at all? His religious background, maybe. I was thinking maybe he had a Catholic background. Maybe I'd find baptismal ledgers, marriage ledgers, something like that. Catholic records can be great. The first daughter said, no, Dad didn't really have an affiliation. Second daughter said, well, sure, Dad was Jewish. And I don't know if the sisters had really discussed this at all. I think they were in their 80s, but they disagreed. And they weren't really sure, neither was really sure which one was right. So we tested the DNA. Now, I'll start, before we talk about this, start by saying that ethnicity estimates, while they are the most heavily marketed part of DNA testing, certainly for Ancestry.com, they need to be taken with a large grain of salt. My feeling is that the reason for DNA testing for genealogy purposes is not as much the ethnicity estimate as it is the value in finding matches and understanding more about relatives that you might not otherwise be able to find that kind of information. I know a lot of people who, Ashkenazi Jews, have been tested. People laugh and say, well, I'm 92%. Well, I'm 97%. That's not a relevant difference. Whether you're 98% Eastern European Jewish or you're 92 is not really important. However, for the first daughter and the second daughter, the same results, you can see in the ethnicity estimate, she's 47% Eastern European Jewish. Well, clearly, one parent was Jewish. You get 50% from each parent. One was Jewish. The mother's side is very well documented. That's not up for discussion, so clearly Jack was Jewish. Now, looking at the DNA matches for the daughters, we saw the two sisters obviously come up as an immediate family match. Not a surprise, not like the sisters Ross was talking about. The closest match is this MLDSZ, which is fascinating because it's quite high, a possible range of first to second cousins. This shows the numerical data of the centrum organs. I'm not going to get into that. I'm not an expert in the science of the DNA matches. But then looking further down, there's a match for Edna, Dean, and Judith. When I started, Dean actually, his results didn't show up. Edna, as I found very quickly, is related to their mother's family. So I can eliminate her. She's not related to Jack. But then again, we're talking about the shared matches. Looking at the shared matches with MLDSZ, I saw that she's also partly half Eastern European Jewish, and all these, MLDSZ, Dean and Judith are clearly all Jack's family, somehow, not clear how. You can send messages to people through all of these websites. They allow you to message through the site. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't monitor those and don't have the notifications set up properly to get those messages. So here I could see that this woman had not logged on since 2016 and still hasn't. So she wasn't getting my messages, and clearly I was going to have to go at this from another angle. So looking at Judith's match, I was able to build a large tree for her family. It was the best first place to start. This is all Judith's parents' generation, grandparents' generation, and I saw lots of surnames coming up, Jaffe and Krasnopolsky, Fagan, Levine over here, and Levy, but I really didn't know where Jack fit, bless you. I saw, given how close a match Judith was, I thought maybe I was looking for a son of one of these people. I was the second to third cousin match. So she's down here. I thought maybe there's a son here who disappeared, but I looked at every angle, and there wasn't anybody who, seemed to have a name change or, went poof in the air. So then the match for Dean came up. Again, I built a tree for him. I actually was able to speak with him on the phone. The lovely guy, he knew nothing. He said, look, I'll tell you what I know, but I don't know if I can help you. I built this tree and found that he had a common ancestor with Judith, which is what the DNA results show, but we can't always find that connection, that piece. But Moses Krasnopolsky is Judith's ancestor and Dean's ancestor. So we know that somehow Jack is a Krasnopolsky. We don't know how. So fortunately, this you can see the full tree of all the Krasnopolskys. Some of them changed the name to Redfield, so it gets confusing. So finally, not through DNA, just through good, persistent detective work, I was able to figure out who MLDSE is and able to speak with her. She never received my messages. She was very happy to talk to me. She's a lovely woman. But again, she said, well, I don't know if I can help you, but I'll tell you about my family. And she has one parent who's Jewish and one who's not, so we were able to at least zero in on the right set of grandparents. So built her tree, and she was telling me about the Brotmans. She's a Brotman. And her grandfather, Henry Brotman, and Lillian Malkowski, her grandmother, and we weren't really sure where we were looking. And she told me that Henry was one of 5 children. And she named Henry and Mary and Samuel and Jacob. And I said, I think I'm missing something. You said there were 5 children. That was 4 names. She said, oh, right, yeah, Abe. Abe was the oldest, and Abe left to serve in World War I and is never heard from again. So right there, I said, okay, I'm going to do a little more research, but I think I'm working for Abe's family right now. I think that's what's going on. And sure enough, I found pretty quickly that Henry and Abe's mother was Vera Krasnopolsky. I don't know exactly. I believe Vera is a sibling of the other Moses Krasnopolsky, but that record, I couldn't find anything about Vera's parents. But that's likely to be the relationship. And if you remember, I always go on the theory that when you get anecdotes from family, and it seems that there's a lot of conflicting information, there are stories that don't seem to add up, that don't seem to make sense. Very often there's some kernels of truth in those stories, even if it's just that these are stories that have been passed down for 100 years or more than 100 years, and it's really a game of telephone, that things just keep getting changed or embellished as time goes on. There's always something in there that we find that was true. And if you remember, Jack Williams did say on a couple of documents that his mother was named Vera. So he kind of slipped up with the truth a couple of times. So I was able to fill in the tree properly with all the children of Solomon and Vera, including Jack Stanley Williams. Fortunately, the families have been in touch and spoken. We'll never know why Abe became Jack and left. And we don't even know if he had contact with his family. He may have had contact, and just the younger generations weren't aware of that later on. But that hopefully gives you a sense of what can be done with DNA. Obviously, this is kind of a dramatic story with this person who, had no background, seemed to fall out of the sky, and now we know where he came from. But these are the kinds of things that can be done with it. Yeah. Yeah.
This may be for the rabbi, this may be for you.
Okay.
It was something that came up at our lunch table. Someone said, I don't get it. Someone who's raised Baptist in Iowa, this was someone I met, gets a test result that says, you're Jewish. And I'm like, does that mean that he has genetic background that matches with other people who are Jewish? But he's like, no, I found out I was Jewish, so I went to the rabbi and just learned Hebrew and started going to synagogue because I was Jewish, which isn't necessarily my understanding of being Jewish.
So I'll answer the question of how I thought you were going to say something else, but I'm going to tell you what I thought you were going to say and how I would have answered it, and then how I'm going to answer the question. First of all, does somebody mind just, Alexis, will you do me a favor? Will you just run outside and ask them to turn the lights on? We're done with the slides.
No.
Oh,
Russ
wait,
has a couple.
Oh, we still silent?
Yeah.
Okay, then I'll talk in the dark. So I thought you were going to say that if somebody said to you, I was raised Baptist or whatever I was raised, yeah, my mother was Jewish, but I've never done anything, am I Jewish? And my answer would have been, despite the fact that they did nothing, yes, that person halakhically, and this goes back to what Michael was talking about before, is Jewish, could have an aliyah, all of those pieces, despite the fact that they didn't do Jewish at all, it's just genetic.
What if they weren't circumcised?
So, it's a great question. Circumcision doesn't determine Jewish identity. You are Jewish whether you have a circumcision or not. However, halakhically, one should not be called to the Torah if they are not circumcised. I have never asked that question. But I will tell you questions that I constantly ask. More than you can imagine. Most of the time, there really are no differences between being a female rabbi and a male rabbi. I work with lots of women on conversion. I do work with a number of men, and I say to them, point blank, are you circumcised? Most of them say yes. Those who don't, I then have to talk to them about if they want to go through conversion, they're going to need to get a circumcision. And even if they are circumcised, and again, I'm sitting in my office having this conversation saying, I know that I have no idea what this feels like for you. But I do say that to complete the conversion process, you must do hatafat namrit, which is the pinprick of blood that Shemet Tola, the Moyle, that was one of the things he was speaking about. So your question of if somebody found out they had Jewish ancestry or heritage or DNA, if they couldn't, most likely they
He was
would.
adopted, he had no idea who his birth parents was, he was raised.
Okay, so I would absolutely have that person go through a full conversion. Even if, from a technical point of view, maybe there was a matrilineal Jewish thing that went all the way through, they would need to. The chances of that being the case is so low. And the affirmation of becoming Jewish and entering into it is something I would have them do again. And I had a congregant in Syracuse who didn't go through with me, but she had gone through this, that she realized later in life that because of the Holocaust, she was halakhically Jewish, but she wasn't raised Jewish. She married a woman who wasn't Jewish. She then found out, again, she was Jewish and went through a complete conversion, even though halakhically she didn't need to do it. And that's something that I encourage. And in fact, this comes out more often than you imagine. I can tell you at least a dozen stories. I've been around 15 years of people who've sat in my office where I do not try to pry. It's not a matter of prying. It's asking very simple questions that are part of an intake about a baby name or never told their parents. Nobody was hiding anything. And this is a longer conversation about denominations, and the question was asked earlier about rabbinic malpractice and should we be sharing versus not sharing, how different groups see it. But I have taken numerous people to the mikvah over my 15 years who didn't intend to convert, but they affirmed their
They thought they were Jewish.
They thought they were Jewish, and and this is to me the essence of this whole conversation. They're Jewish from a sociological, historical, most likely even geographic perspective. So their ancestry would show that they were from the Eastern European areas, but that might have been just the father's side. So I try not to, and this I'm speaking as just me, one rabbi, while I try not to pry, the minute something comes up, I also can't avoid a question. Came up last week, talking to somebody, talking about a future child, talking about what the name, what that child's name is going to be, and talking about, is there somebody you think you might name it after? And I say to one future parent, what's your Hebrew name? I say to this future parent, what's your Hebrew name? And that one says, I don't have one. And I said, okay, and that sometimes happens, and I say, well, my parents got divorced when I was young, my mom wasn't Jewish, my dad was Jewish, I started exploring Judaism later on. This is somebody who I've seen for years. Never would it have occurred to me that halakhically there is a question. I always stumble over my words, but somehow, I get it out sensitively enough, and that person is going to actually go through the complete affirmation process with me in the coming months before their child is born, so that there isn't a question about the Jewish completeness, if that's a fair word, of their family unit. But I think it's really complicated, and I think one of the I'm sorry, I'm taking my time. One of the reasons it's really complicated is because in the 80s and 90s, when, and this is not a slight against the reform movement, because there's all different movements that could do this to each other. When the reform movement made the decision to do patrilineal descent and affirm patrilineal descent, I don't think it was necessarily, and Jeff's a reform rabbi, so he can either defend or agree either way. I don't have a problem with the reform movement deciding to do patrilineal descent. My concern about the decision of the reform movement with doing patrilineal descent is I don't think there was informed consent with the implications generationally. And that's where we run into some problems, and because in the reform movement, as I understand it, different rabbis, there isn't one standard of rabbinic practice of what mandates a conversion. So, one more story and then I'll stop. My third month of a rabbi, so it's like Ross's, third year of that. My third month of a rabbi, I'm sitting upstate and meeting with a parent, a woman who had been appointed to be like the bar and bat mitzvah liaison, because she had an 8th grader, and so she was helping me work with the 7th grade families on how do you make it through a bar and bat mitzvah process. And this person was on my search committee, and she was amazing, and she's saying to me, Rabbi, I'm just a little comfortable in this position. I said, why? And she's on the board of the synagogue, and she said, well, I wasn't raised Jewish. And I thought, okay. And she goes, and when I converted, all the rabbi had me do was go to the bima, open the ark, affirm that I wanted to be Jewish, and I was Jewish. Well, so remember, she's a parent of an 8th grader. So what does that mean for her
ago when we were in Israel, this gets back to this issue of data descent. It gets back to something brought up earlier about, and ties to something that I guess that sparked a neuron for me was we were having lunch with a friend of mine who's lived in Israel now for 25 years now, Erica, and his wife, who he's U.S. and Israeli. He spent half his life here, half his life there. It's a long story, but met his partner when he was out of university here and decided to live there and has lived there. And they decided for many reasons to wait many years to get married. They just got married about 4 or 5 years ago. Is that about right? And she's from Israel, and the grief that he, who again raised Jewish in America, no issues of like what Rachel brought up. But the reason I bring up the following is that he spent at least 6 months and a significant amount of money to find a cemetery, right, in the States where they could find the photo of his great-grandmother's grave to show that it had a Jewish star, so that the rabbinate would marry them in Israel, with no issue about denomination. And the reason I bring this up is that one of the interesting questions will be moving forward, if he had a report that showed whatever that percentage is, would that be something at some point that the rabbinate, or maybe they will, and Harry may know or others, it'll be interesting to see at some point whether they even allow it. I guarantee you it's being shoved in their face and will probably more often all of the time. And it'll be very interesting to see how this, because how is that different than getting the photograph of a gravestone from 100 years ago? It's information the same way, and the reason I bring it up is that Lauren's example showed you're not using genetic data by itself. You're using genetic data with everything else. The same way we as doctors don't use genetic data by itself. It's genetic data and everything else. And so I think what we all have to get comfortable with is the idea that this information is part of that story. And the interesting question will be, again, getting back to the whole issue of our religion and the science will be, how do you modernize where the two intersect, that synapse? How do you modernize that? It'll be interesting because I think it'll be easier, for example, in the U.S. than for the rabbinate, but I guarantee you they're going to have to deal with it. And for the way he described it to me, and Rachel, I'm sure, knows more about this than Jeff than I do, is that there was a lot of judgment in the individual of the rabbinate that day with the information. Meaning, it's not like they codify it. So it's ironic that you could have one person who takes the ancestry information and goes, I'm going to use that as supporting data, and the next day, the next person can be like, you know what, that's just genetics. I want to see, real. And so I think it's going to be very interesting. I bring it up in the next decade to see how that dialogue evolves both here and in the different movements in the U.S., but also in the sort of in the place where it's the most challenging, which is in Israel, specifically not for right of return, but the marriage burial issues that Rachel brought up.
So Alan has a question, and then we're going to have Ross and Lauren finish up their presentation, and then we're going to do a wrap-up. Alan.
Just as the inconsistency sometimes that seem to occur, philosophically and scientifically, kind of feels like it's going to parallel the Innocence Project, with DNA and how you know who's innocent, who's there. We're looking at the genetics, and now we're going to be looking at who's Jewish and who's not. That's going to get more revealed as science gets more precise. There's like interesting inconsistencies. I've always felt like you follow the matrilineal line of you're Jewish, which I always thought was what we used to persons in the body, but they're perfectly willing to accept when you're a Kohen or whatever. So matrilineal. And then the other inconsistency I always felt confused about was that if you are Jewish and adopt a child at birth, the halacha requirement is that the son sits shiva for their biological father, but doesn't have to do it for their adopted father, halachically or something. So
Well, so
inconsistency.
in terms of answering Alan's second half, in the more traditional movements, the Jewish lineage goes through the mother, and the tribe, Kohen Levi Israel, goes through the father. Yes, there's definitely a question of where does an adoptive child fall in that. I don't know any adoptive children that don't sit shiva for their adoptive parents.
don't want to spend a lot of time on, I've got a few more slides on medical implications because I think it's a very long conversation and I'm happy to have it with anybody anytime and we can talk about it at the wrap up or any other time. But I just want to say a few words about this concept that I think Harry introduced, that there's a lot of information linking specific risks for specific diseases to, at a minimum, the Ashkenazi Jewish subsection of the Jewish faith. And as you saw examples through lots of work by scholars, him and others in the field, even to other groups. And so, the same things that Lauren brought up, that the small size, at least with this interesting bottleneck, and relative genetic homogeneity of the, again, Ashkenazi more than non-Ashkenazi Jews, has very specific implications for genetic testing. And I think all of us know a lot about this. I don't want to, go from square one and teach you all about, Jewish genetic testing, but, we all, I think, know about Tay-Sachs, and most of us are aware that there's now a very significant panel of tests that are usually done at the same time. So because there's a whole series of diseases where they're incredibly rare, but if two people are carriers, it's information that if you elect to know, that could have major implications. But that's the easy thing. To me, that's easy, and we do that as in this country at any healthcare facility quite well, and I don't think it's hard to find experts or tests or interpretation. What I think is hard, and this already came up a couple of times today, Shari brought it up, is this idea that for many of these more common heritable traits in the general population, like BRCA1 and BRCA2, which are not uncommon in broad population in the U.S., but are even more common in at least in the Ashkenazi, not the Ashkenazi Jewish population. And even if they're not more common, there are specific variants within that are specific, either unique to or enriched in. And what that means is that what you test and how you interpret it are different if you're of an Ashkenazi Jewish descent than if you are not. And, in what I would have said a couple of years ago, let's say even 5 years ago at Sloan Kettering, would be that if we had a woman with early onset breast or ovarian cancer who wanted to be tested and they were of Ashkenazi Jewish descent, we would have had a different conversation with her and what tests were done and the implications than if she was not. And that is, I think, something that's changing quite a bit, because now we kind of test everybody as long as they're willing to opt in. So if when you get your tumor tested, we want to know about it. And so we've moved to a very different scenario where we don't just have a long conversation about whether to test. We reflex the test unless people opt out, and we can talk about that. But I think the issue I want to bring up is twofold. The first is that there are some nuances of the medical implications that being Jewish, and particularly Ashkenazi Jewish, where we know more than for the other subsections of Jewish descent, where there are nuances that are important. What allele you're tested. Also, in an individual gene like BRCA1, not every mutation that's identified in every family has the same implications. Some of them have higher risk, that your risk of cancer is higher than others. So you might imagine that if there's a specific variant that's more common in Jewish descent, you might actually have a different conversation. Same is true of cystic fibrosis and other diseases. The severity of the disease and whether you get it is different. And that means that there's nuances here. Most doctors don't even understand that, let alone most patients. So I just make the point that there's a level of nuance that's really important. But the thing I want to leave you with on this aspect is that there's a lot we know, but there's much, much more. Much, much, much more we don't know. The idea, and Shari brought up this issue that we run a test for BRCA1 and you're negative, that's a preposterous implication. When we do genetic testing or genome sequencing, first of all, everything we find, 98% of it, we don't even know 1% of what it means. So the idea that you run a test and people tell you that you should drink more caffeine and do this is preposterous. These things are associated with things, but they're not so straightforward and causal. And the second is our technology isn't perfect. I always tell the story that, we all remember, when we were kids, when there weren't MRIs and maybe even really CT scans, you got an X-ray, and you saw a little, spot or you didn't, and when you had pneumonia, now you get a CT scan. Imagine that genetic testing is like that. That the genomic testing of today is way better than the genomic testing of 10 years ago. But the genomic testing of 10 years from now is going to find things in the sequence that we didn't have the ability to either find or to interpret. So it's never at the asymptote. A positive test is informative, although there's a lot of known unknowns. There's a heck of a lot, not to quote Rumsfeld more than that, of unknown unknowns. A lot we don't understand in the genome. So we're entering an era where we're going to accumulate more and more information. We have to be comfortable with some level of uncertainty. And I think what's hard, as a doctor, that I think we have to all get comfortable with is this concept of uncertainty. I think what really struck me in Harry's presentation was the description of Victor McCusick going to Talha Shomer with an expert who just walked from room to room and could say, oh, this person's at high risk for this disease, this person's at high risk for that. He wasn't saying he knew everything about that person, but he was using a complex pattern of information, ethnicity, but probably not just the ethnicity, everything else about them, to make a decision. That's how we are all trained as doctors. Genetics is never going to get rid of that. Genetics is just going to make it more granular to allow our pattern recognition to get a little bit better. But we're always going to be in the scenario that the genetics will tell us that things may or may not be possible, may or may not be at risk, and have to be interpreted with everything else. So I think something that the companies that I worry about, the consumer companies maybe do a disservice, is the idea that it tells you things and that you'll know, and that's where you're going to be, that you're going to get this variant, and it explains why you like to sleep till 11, and it's hard to get up in the morning, and the other person who doesn't is an early morning person. No way. Like, the genetics are going to be much more complicated. But it comes from a good place because we all as people have a desire, I think, to have rational explanations for things that before we had that information weren't understood. And that's why we talk about religion. It's why we talk about science. And so I think what I want to leave you with is the idea that all this information is powerful and exciting, but it's also challenging. And that uncertainty is actually something that we have to actually embrace and actually say it's an opportunity. And I think in many ways, the duality between science and religion will be more invigorating because the uncertainty will allow us to bring these two things together. And so I don't look as a doctor and scientist and say, we're going to figure it all out in 5 years. I am saying we're going to have new questions in 5 years, and boy, there'll be new things to figure out that are more complicated than before. Some things we'll have figured out. There's always new things that we'll figure out. There'll be tests where the genetic test will be boom, we'll figure it out. But there's a million things that we see in medicine, health, and disease in our lives every day where there's things we don't even know. And I think that's, where things maybe, we have to sort of always, fight with this need for a rational explanation for everything. And we have to understand science doesn't just answer questions, it asks them, as Michael said earlier today. I think you were going to...
Yeah, I'm going to go to the top of the slide. Jewish in parentheses. You just said some very interesting things which triggered the following questions. The genetic discussion that we're having today is really a relatively new one. It's post-CAT scanning, it's post-MRI in terms of the testing and the science and the new information. That's the beginning of my question. Is that correct? It's 10, 20 years old, 30 years old, all of this new genome?
I think that's a fair assessment. The first tests were probably done in the 80s, if you look for medical testing. So I think that's fair.
The world is flat. We have the state of Israel for 70 years. Science is global. Communication is global. Why always, not just today, why are we always talking about Ashkenazi information and not Sephardic?
Well, and Harry, I think, should...
my wife is telling me...
Harry, I think I touched on this and probably an interesting area. I'm going to punt the question to him in a sec. I think the question fundamentally is, how close are we to having as the same understanding of both the genealogy and the medical implications of Sephardic Jewry writ large and the different subsets? And I guess just to put, Harry, is that a fair question?
Yeah. So, we certainly know a lot about the genealogies that haven't been picked
if I can add something, it's important to remember we think of Ashkenazic and Sephardi as being the two groups. And certainly as Ashkenazic Jews, we feel very comfortable saying that because we know that Ashkenazic Jewry came from a very small area, the Pale of Settlement, a very small strip of land that we were able to live in from the Baltic Sea in the north, Lithuania and north of Poland, that area, south through Belarus, Poland, Romania, Hungary, and the Ukraine. So you're dealing with a very concentrated group, and people moved throughout the Pale a tremendous amount, much greater distances than we often give them credit for. Sephardi Jews, though, that's an umbrella term. I mean, it's important to remember back to Harry's talk this morning, the graph, the bar graph he had, showing all the different subsets. Iranian Jews, very different from, let's say, Tunisian Jews or Moroccan. For DNA purposes, this is not an umbrella. It's not the same kind of thing as Ashkenazim. Sure.
Maybe take 2 questions, then I know we're going to have a conversation on the wrap-up, so please, go ahead.
First, to you, we can solve all this easily. How much does it actually cost to get your grandmother's gravestone, have carved out of the same problem? But more to the rabbi, the genetics, the question about the genetics of halacha is based on the fact that halacha maybe doesn't have the precedent in the Talmud and the backer about with genetics. So I can think of in the Bible, there's a story of Jacob manipulating the birth of his goats and sheep with the rods. That sounds like genetics, but nobody's ever been able to figure that out. And the other thing is that in the halacha, there's discussion about relations that you cannot have, Yavama, right? It's about all the different levels of relations. That's sort of genetic. So I'm asking you, what other genetic precedent is in the Talmud?
What other genetic precedent is in the Talmud?
In other words, things that might eventually lead to the fact that we can recognize.
Well, I can answer it backwards. A question that they might not have imagined coming up, but tradition has been used to answer the question, and I can't sit here and give you chapter and verse, but the question of surrogacy. What constitutes Jewish identity of a baby born to a surrogate mother? Is it the materials? Is it the genetic materials? Or is it the womb? So halachically, it's the womb. So the birth mother is the determining factor in the Jewish identity of that baby, even if the egg and the sperm were from 2 Jewish parents. And that child needs to be converted halachically. And the reason I believe that it is, aside from what the texts say, is because if we start talking about life beginning at materials, meaning sperm and egg, and not in birth, then we have a whole discussion about issues of abortion and choice. And right now, Judaism, I don't know if this is going to change, while Judaism doesn't celebrate abortion, it allows for abortion, and it certainly allows for abortion in the sake of saving a mother's life, and the mother being defined by the birth mother. And so I don't think we're going to get to a point where the egg, the identity of that egg, is going to become the determining factor for that.
So conversely, if you have genetic material from 2 people who are not Jews, but it comes out of the birth canal of a Jewish
Baby's
surrogate,
Jewish.
the baby has 0 genetics, but
And totally halachically Jewish.
Cesarean versus vaginal birth?
Doesn't matter.
That only matters for Pigeon Haben.
Right. Yeah.
It's microbiome.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
saying is a whole new panel with that, right? And the other question I have is I have a daughter and 3 granddaughters, so I think I'm going to have it, but is that fair to my little granddaughters, ages 6 months to 9 years old?
I want to jump in before Ross even answers. I don't want to put Ross in a position of offering medical advice. I mean that seriously, like full medical advice. I think you're offering things in general without knowing anybody's specific history. So I think we just need to be very careful with.
Two general comments. The first is what Shari said earlier, which is a test done 10 years ago wouldn't have the same comprehensiveness as a test done now, and that probably is true of a test done now as a test done 10 years from now. So I would counsel any person that if the clinical scenario warranted and I knew what test was done, I would assess it and say if there is a more comprehensive test now and it's warranted, that we should have a conversation about that. The second issue you bring up and it came up earlier, of what do you do in genetic testing when you've got children? The short answer is that's the whole field of genetic counseling was created for, because we think as a medical profession that this conversation is really important to have, and it's very personal, and that there are implications, both personal, legal, moral, and medical, that need to be talked about, that we would do that. I actually think one of the things I worry about in our field, I have 2 real worries in the biomedical field and genetics that keep me up at night. One is that we're moving out of that world to a world where everyone's going to get tested unless they opt out. And so I think there's, like running these tests 23andMe, are we going to be in a scenario where people really don't consider all the implications sufficiently? We have to do a better job as doctors of making sure, and healthcare providers, of making sure people really understand these issues with as much you can of all of those scenarios. The other thing that keeps me up at night, I have to say I worry about, is it's getting so hard to keep track of all this information, will be how do healthcare providers actually know all of this? And something I was following on Twitter this past week is there's a huge movement in medicine to say that a lot of the things like genetics and genomics, maybe doctors don't need to learn all that in medical school because there's too much, and they should worry about, more general issues like talking to patients and like, they shouldn't learn, and I worry that, though I think that's also really important, that if the next generation of doctors doesn't really understand genetics and genomics on their fingertip, they're going to be massively handicapped. So I'm a big believer in my profession of 2 things. One is the next generation have to learn at a level that the people of my era and before don't. And the second is that the people that are in practice a long time, they're going to be in practice a while. We better find a way to get them retrained. And so in my field, which is hematology, I've been pushing really hard for our hematologists to learn genetics, even if it's not just how to read a blood cell, because they're in a world where this is now happening in every interaction they have. And so I think that these are issues that, and the reason I bring all this up is that the ultimate responsibility is on all of us. It's on patients, it's on their families, it's on doctors, it's on nurses, that we as a group need to sort of understand this at whatever level we can, given our time and expertise, and be part of it. That patients have to advocate, that you're going to make decisions about what information you want, whether it's in your doctor's office or consumer, as best you can, that you want to ask the right questions, talk to the right people, with the caveat that there's no, perfect is the enemy of good, right? So you just want to do the best you can, and we, as a society, have to get comfortable with that. It's not like it used to be, where every genetic test was a 5-hour conversation about whether to do it. That was the 1980s. And I think that's just, it's like a brave new and frightening world, and it's all about whether you engage or not engage, and I think most of us are going to engage. So you're asking really good questions. I'm happy to talk offline about specifics and direct you to the right experts, but they bring up weighty issues that I think in this complicated world we live in are not easily addressed in general or in specifics.
So I want to thank Ross and Lauren for this segment. And Lauren and Michael to switch seats, and we'll get the lights turned on. Alexis, could you do me a favor now? Actually, Alan, will you just ask them to turn the lights on?
No,
associated with our group?
Well, there were more than 3 diseases.
But there were 3 that I've heard of. Can you address where they came from? How did that come to be? That our group would be...
So the question was, and unfortunately it's more than 3, but the concept of Jewish genetic diseases, where did those diseases come from? And I think your follow-up question is, and how did they impact this genetic group? I don't know if that's a question.
Let me give it.
Yeah.
I'll give a short answer, and then I'll let Harry expand upon it. There are, in essence, 2 ways that some of these diseases increase in frequency in the Jewish population, as there are cystic fibrosis is very common is much more common among Caucasians of European origin than other populations. But Jewish diseases associated genetic risk factors for disease could result from selection, in which case, for some reason, that there are complex mechanisms that allow a mutation in the DNA to be selected for. The most well-known case of that is sickle cell disease in its heterozygous state, in which you get one normal gene, quote, normal gene, and one the affected gene from the other parent. The heterozygote that has 2 different chains of hemoglobin is much less at risk of getting severe malaria. So it's possible, and there are a whole bunch of theories about some of these mutations in the Jewish population due to such natural selection. The other side, because of that bottleneck that Harry mentioned, where the population went down, and that you get a lot of, in essence, sort of inbreeding among those people, that you get these defects at increased frequency during this period of bottlenecks.
Right, and through the bottleneck, of course, some mutations got lost as well. But with regard to your question about when, the answer is throughout Jewish history. And so some conditions clearly arose in ancient times, like G6PD deficiency we mentioned. It's only a disease of anemia when you take the wrong drugs, such as anti-malarial drugs, but it's found throughout the Mediterranean basin, same mutation, Jews and non-Jews, widely distributed among Jewish groups, except, interestingly, Ashkenazim. So an example of what got lost in the bottleneck, in my opinion. But other conditions that arose much later. We've heard reference to diseases like Bloom syndrome and Canavan disease and familial dysautonomia. And these are diseases of the Jewish diaspora in the Pale of Settlement in Eastern Europe. And this was a popular topic a generation ago. Richard Goodman, who was the great cataloger, a great generation ago, attempted to pinpoint where these arose based on the places of origin of the grandparents, and to really point out places in the Pale of Settlement where these conditions may have arisen. So 2 important forces, selection and drift, as Michael mentioned, and then answer is when, answer is always.
And then the other just general concept, which I think you asked, is like, why do these things happen? I just remind everyone, this is something Michael brought up in his talk, is that I just want you all to remember something, is that the human genetic blueprint is 3 billion individual letters of code. And every single time, every cell has to divide, it has to, as best it can, perfectly replicate that with a machinery that needs to have extraordinarily high fidelity. And when we talk about extraordinarily high fidelity of replication of DNA, we're talking, most people believe, in the order of about 1 in a billion. That's roughly what people think the fidelity. So I want you to do the math of what I just said, is that you have 3 billion things that have to be replicated, and there's an error, 1 in a billion. And imagine that means that in the average cell, there are 3 errors, and then you have billions of cells, or in the case of sperm, lots of sperm and eggs. So the short answer is the basis for how these things arise is because as incredibly accurate as the replication of DNA is, it makes errors. And that's probably one of the reasons why mutations or variants in the DNA blueprint that are that have some effect occur. And we have just the whiff of an understanding of why it's in that gene that's Tay-Sachs and not in some other area that's innocuous. And that's, I think, something that's going to be really fascinating in the next few decades to learn, not just about like what are the medical effects, but why that spot of the genome and not that spot. It's not going to be so simple that every spot is equally at risk of getting messed up. We're going to find out, just like, think about when you write your, you type. You know, I bet if you look at the first word you type, that the chance that you'll make an error in the first word is much, much lower than in the 100th word, probably because you get a little tired, or because you look at that first word and you look at it over and over again. So imagine the scenario that we begin to understand that aspect. So I think it's going to be fun in science to learn why fundamentally some parts of our genome where there are diseases that occur are more likely to be messed up in this complicated, beautiful process of replication than others not. And that's a scientific, and the short answer is it's a great question that we're just beginning to understand.
Just to follow up on that, I think the error and spell check analogy of Google, when you write a message, it comes across, and it'll correct it many times. Our cells also have our DNA. There are mechanisms for DNA repair to catch it, but still the error rate, even extremely low, is think how many cells there are and how many individuals there are. So of course, occasionally an error appears, a mutation appears, that then is either transmitted because of connection between two individuals who share that mutation, or it happens to provide a selective benefit to the holder of that mutation.
Chair?
One of the benefits of the Affordable Care Act reportedly was that there would be an expectation for accountable care organizations or health systems to have data that could be imported or exported to another health system. And there's been difficulty, I think, across the nation of having a unitary medical record. But in terms of acquiring the genetic data that you're talking about, who's going to carry the information? If there may be reposing, or there may be a repository that has all the data, how does it get transferred?
So there's two interesting issues that you bring up. The first is going to be, with 1 million people having their genome sequenced, will be how is that information handled and shared? And I think, again, perfect being the enemy of good, or if we don't try, I think it's going to be a great experience to see how this country handles 1 million people's genomes being sequenced and how that information is used and shared and privacy is protected and all of that. And I'm hoping that they'll actually develop practices in that are useful when the other 288 million people get their genome sequenced after. We learned anything the Human Genome Project was. Sequencing those genomes taught us a lot in science. But the other thing you bring up, and you may know about this, but not everybody, is there was a Times article about a month ago about a company that most of you probably never heard of called Epic. I don't know if anyone's heard of Epic. Epic is I know you have. I know I have. So Epic's a company in Wisconsin that has cornered about 50 or 60% of the medical records market of large hospitals. They actually don't care so much about small providers, but if you go to New York Presbyterian or parts of Sloan Kettering, we use actually only parts of Epic for Long Story, and they're making more money than anyone's ever managed could be made on that information, because they deliver a product that allows hospitals to bill for everything the doctor does. But the two things they don't do well is make that an easy experience, and that's a totally different information. I don't want to get into that. Doctors actually hate the system. Billers love it. But the thing that's interesting is that the people at Epic have essentially, as far as I can understand, no understanding of genetics and no understanding of how complex information like that can be brought into their beautiful, easily billable system. And so the interesting thing that a lot of us at a cancer center is we look at the information we're getting on our patients, there's no way to squeeze that into this beautiful thing that they've developed. That's one of the reasons why we actually haven't adopted it fully. So the short answer is there is no current solution. So what we see at Sloan Kettering is we have come up with our own solutions where we actually put the information as we see sequence patients every day on a server that allows our doctors to look at it in a way that we think is intuitive and useful, that is freeware, so we let other people use it. Our hope is that that system, as well as many others, will get used. But I see patients or people call me all the time who show up with a hard drive and say, I got my data sequenced at another hospital. The only way for me to get it to you was a hard drive. So all I'm saying is you're asking a really important question that is front and center for many of us, but these solutions are going to take a lot more time and money than they probably should.
So we want to wrap up. Michael, do you have any closing words, reflections on the day?
Again, I to thank the audience and participants for coming out. I think we got a great turnout, lots of interest. I apologize for taking too much time in my presentation, not allowing more time for discussion. Obviously, Harry Ostrith, for his presentation, which set it all off, it was just great. Just make a couple of comments. For me, I think the issue about Jews and genetics is very interesting. What is it telling us? What's the end point of the discovery process? Historically, there's lots of interest about the connectedness among the Jewish people. My sense is that there is no Jewish gene, just like there are some of these disease-associated genotypes, gene-associated mutations in the genome. They are risk factors. We may have a whole complex of associated genes, but you should be able to go. Everybody has a right to their genetic information and use it, but they should go to a genetic counselor to look at risk factors for associated diseases. These risk factors is, in the case of religion, we should go to religious counselors to see what the implications are. Choose your rabbi to tell you what, given the choices, to go to the rabbi and tell you what halachically or in any other way. But association is not causation. The fact that I'm, 99% Ashkenazi, which I didn't need a genetic test to tell me, does not imply that I'm going to go to synagogue on Shabbos. Right. So I think we have to have an understanding of what the implications very soon. But the other thing that I thought was so powerful today was the stories in the conversion panel. That is it's the connectedness of the Jewish people in any way you want to look at it, whether you have to have a strand or whole sequences of DNA, or you feel a connectedness to being part of a community that in essence. But that raises the other side of the question I always have some discussions with the rabbi is what's our sense of the common humanity? Harry raised it in terms of the sociology battle between geneticists who may be looking at population level average distances across populations and sociologists who don't see that. When the Human Genome started, Francis Collins, the head of the Human Genome Project at the time, now NIH director, said this will demonstrate the common humanity of all of us. And maybe that's the starting point, but there's this exclusion-inclusion paradox that we all have to live with.
The only thing that I'd say are that as a participant today, I'm just amazed how much I learned from everybody in the room today. Michael, Harry, Lauren, Rachel, the whole panel. To me, I was humbled by what I learned from my colleagues today, and for that I'm very appreciative. The second thing I'll say is that, beyond everyone's participation today, and Jeff and his organization, what they're doing is remarkable. And for us to be even a small part of that is really an honor and a privilege, and we really greatly appreciate not only our role in it, but the greater thing that you're doing and how important it is. And we're really excited that you're doing it. Can't wait to hear more about it and read those emails. And the last thing I just want to add on a personal note is that to work with both Rachel and Michael, who put an incredible amount of time and effort into it. I can say that because I put less than they did. Again, it's just been an extraordinary pleasure. both of them, and I would do it anytime, any day, on any topic, because there's nobody better to work with.
So I'll take the closing remarks. This really has been a labor of love for all of us, and an exploration of ideas that, as I started at the beginning of the day, that if we as members of the Jewish community, whether born Jewish or not, can engage in how larger ideas, science, history, sociology, genetics, you name it, music, art, play a role in how we see ourselves, we're doing a disservice to what it means to be fully Jewish. And that's why, over the course of any given year here at the synagogue, Harriet and I and others, and many of you, try to provide experiences where we can see those moments of intersection. And there are so many questions that are implied from each of this. I mean, look, you already heard so many stories that I shared just from a few people sitting in my office. Trust me, that I could go on any topic. But it's really incredible. And what I want today to demonstrate, yes, to be about genetics and Judaism, yes, the importance of science and religion, yes, the importance of thinking about Jewish peoplehood, which I think is a question of Jewish identity, which is shifting a lot. The next generation, so kids today, teens and younger, have a different concept of what it means to be part of a Jewish people, and how I'm looking at Miles. Miles was at my house last night for Hebrew High at the Rabbis. There were 9th, 8th, and 9th graders there, and how we have a conversation about what it means to be a part of our Jewish people in relationship to other peoples. Those are all important. But the last thing that's important is that this synagogue, or any synagogue, is built on the strength of our own members. And what that means, if their expertise, like in this case, I was able to tap into Ross and Michael and Lauren, if there's other members that have other expertise that we want to build on, let's do that, because that is so exciting. Because this shouldn't be a top-down experience. This should be something that we're building together. So you're going to get an email tomorrow, and one of the questions is going to be, is there a specific expertise that you have that links with your Jewish identity? And how might you build that up? So think about that for the fall. There are 3 rabbis in the room. We've talked a lot about Rabbi Middleman. I also want to introduce my colleague, Rabbi Richie Hammerman. Richie has 3 children. 2 of his children are rabbis as well, Yael and Eitan. They're friends of mine. Leah's not a rabbi, but an incredible Jewish individual. And it's so fun to have 3 rabbis in a room for part of a Jewish discussion about this. Thank you to Harry, to Michael, to Ross, to Lauren, and to everyone who participated. Stay warm out there. And don't forget, next Saturday we have a fabulous speaker and lots coming up in the months ahead. Thank you.